for this painting. It's a garden photograph by Saxon Holt. I really like the color of the flowers and also the movement of the pathway and the way the lemon tree arches. I feel like it gives a nice overall framing to the painting. Like usual, I'm going to make adjustments in order to fit my composition and take off some information here and there in order to try to not overwork my painting and add too much detail. So here I'm sketching very loosely. I'm just trying to divide up the page and giving rough spacing for the elements that I like to include in my composition. The first thing that I drew out is the lemon tree, and I'm going to use that to measure the rest of the elements around it. Since the aspect ratio of my frame is different to the reference image, I'm just trying to fit the elements according to the space that I have, and I want to include all the colorful elements like the potted plants, the flowers in front, the lemons, and also the red flower on the side. On the right hand side, I'm going to add the pruned plants and also add more at the back. Even though they're all green, I want to use this as practice to separate them using different tones and textures. I left the background mostly empty since I'm going to use the wet on wet technique to paint a blurry background, and I'm just going to make some things up along the way. Once I've placed down all the elements, I also drew out the lemons as ovals just for me to know where they're going to be placed so I can mask it here. This way it's much easier for me to paint the leaves surrounding the lemons without having to avoid those areas. For some of the lemons, I masked off the whole oval, and for some, I only masked a tiny bit at the bottom since I want some leaves to cover the top. I'm also going to mask off the area of the flowers. This way when I paint the greenery surrounding them, it won't cover up those small areas. This way when I paint on the color of the flowers, it'll be brighter since it's not contaminated with the base color of the green. On the right hand side, I also decided to mask off certain areas which will act as the highlights for this glossy plant. I'm also going to mask off areas of the colorful flowers in the foreground. I'm just going to create star shapes or 5-petaled flower shapes for the daffodils, which are the yellow flowers on the left. I made the spacing quite close together around the edges, especially when it's closer to the pathway, and as it's getting closer to the foreground, I tried to make more space to create some perspective. For the bluish purple flowers next to the daffodils, I'm not really sure what these are. It's probably lupin, which are basically small flowers clustered together to create this cone shape as the silhouette. So here I'm just masking off some cone shapes with uneven edges. And just like the daffodils, I tried to make the spacing close together near the pathway and further and more scattered when it's closer to the foreground. I'm also going to mask off some stems and leaves. Next, I'm going to go through all the colors I'll be using. This is Quin Red by Daniel Smith, Yellow Ochre by Holbein, Hansa Yellow Light by Daniel Smith, Hansa Yellow Medium by Daniel Smith, Sepia by Holbein, Sap Green by Holbein, Hooker's Green by Quatman, Ultramarine Finest by Schmincke, Chinese White by Holbein, and I'll also be using Bleed Proof White by Dr. P.H. Martens. I'm going to start by painting the blurry background, so here I'm just using clean water and trying to evenly dampen the surface. I'm only going to dampen the surface where I'm going to place the paint. This way the paint doesn't run elsewhere, but it doesn't have to be so exact. For the color I'm going to mix up all four here, I started by creating a look more delicate. To add texture to the bush at the back, I'm still painting it on very loosely, starting with a light yellow-green from Sap Green and Hansa Yellow Light, and then picking up some of the darker green mixtures from the top of my palette to create the darker values and separate the bush at the back and parts of the lemon tree. I'm going to move on to another area while I wait for that to dry, and this time I'm going to paint on the leaves as well as the stems of the flowers in the foreground. I first added Sap Green to the light yellow green that I already had on my palette on the top left, then I follow it up with Hooker's Green and Sepia. Moving on to the stems and the leaf for the daffodils, I'm going to separate this, so I used a mix of Sap Green, Hansa Yellow Light, and Hooker's Green to create a bright cool green. Then for the darker value, I used Hooker's Green and Sepia again, and I'm placing this near the other flowers, so there's a separation between the lighter and the darker values between those flower bushes. Now I'm going to go back to the purple plant. For this, I use the same mixture as before with Quin Red, Ultramarine Finest, and Sepia, this time in a thicker consistency. And as you can see, I'm filling in more of the plant compared to the reference image just to make this look more dense. As for the texture, I kind of made frilly outlines which comes together on the other end to suggest frilly textures of the leaf. And on the left hand side, I also covered more area using the darker value to suggest the form of the overall plant. Once I've made the frilly textures, I also added some lines directed to the center. Below the pot, I added some grassy texture using the dark green that I already had on my palette. Here I'm adding more Hooker's green to the dark green, and I'm going to paint on the texture of the flower bush behind the purple plant. Next, I'm going to work on the lemon tree. I first use a mix of Hooker's green with the purple that I already had on my palette, and I'm painting this behind the tree trunk and the tree branches. This way I can separate the area of the background and the perimeter of the tree. Next, I'm going to start painting the lighter area of the lemon tree, so I'm using the same mix as the base from Hansa Yellow Light with a little bit of sap green. Using the light green, I just paint on leaf textures in the area where I've allocated the lighter values. Then I'm going to follow this up by adding sap green into the mix for a slightly darker value and paint it around the lighter area. I'm going to slowly build the value, so I'm using a darker green now and I'm placing the darkest green on the left hand side of the tree. I wasn't actually sure what kind of texture I was going for. I was going between just uneven edges and also individual leaves, which I painted earlier for those lighter areas. I have to say that this is probably the area where I've struggled the most with this painting and something that I need to figure out and practice in the future. So I'm open to suggestions if any of you have specific techniques when it comes to painting trees which are close enough for us to see individual leaves. But getting back to the painting here, I'm just going to take off the masking fluid so I can paint on those white areas. Once I finish taking off the masking fluid, I'm going to go back to the lemon tree. I want to redefine the leaf shapes, so here I'm using a mid-tone green, and I also want to paint some leaves at the top part of some of those lemons. And I just find by covering parts of the lemon with the leaves, it sort of brings the elements together as they're interacting with each other. Here I'm outlining or drawing out some leaf shapes using the dark green mix, and I'm painting around some of those leaves so the lighter leaves are left as negative shapes. I'm trying to not paint individual leaves so much, but I still want some of the textures to show through. Around the edges or the perimeter of the tree, I did try to just paint on some leaf textures without outlining it, so those shapes are a bit more abstract and loose. I think at this point of this painting, I've already lost the area for the values, which is very important to remember in order to not overcrowd the painting. Initially, I wanted the lighter greens to be on the right or the top part of the bench area, but at this point I was just trying to work around it and darken the sides instead, so at least the sides are darker in relation to the area of the tree on the right hand side. Here I was just trying to make sense of the tree, and I'm using darker values to push certain areas back and also take off some extra detail and bring forward the lighter colors.